there was a Russian military buildup happened earlier. In fact, a couple of times there were Russian military buildups on the Ukrainian border, and nothing materialized. But this one started last November, and it seemed to be a little more significant in that the troops were staying, they had more weaponry, they seemed to be being placed in strategic locations, sometimes hidden in forests. And so I did predict that there would be an invasion, and actually published an article in the Conversation in Canada that said that, but I did not anticipate a full-scale invasion. And my feeling was, with 150 to 150,000 troops, it was 100 to begin with, and then it went up to 150, that scale was not enough to occupy a country the size of Ukraine. And that's why I didn't think there would be full-scale invasion. But I did notice that this military exercise, this impromptu exercise with Belarus, we're bringing Russian troops very close to the border with Ukraine that were not officially scheduled as location points for the exercise. So that seemed to me a little sinister. And these troops, of course, were the first ones who went over the border and ended up at the Chernobyl nuclear power station. I think on the first day of the war, actually, they got there because it's very close to the border with Belarus. So it took me by surprise, and I think it took a lot of people by surprise. And Putin, of course, makes a habit of invading in February. I mean, he did the same thing when he invaded Crimea back in 2014. And oddly as well, both the invasions came after Olympic Games in which Russia was taking part in. In fact, the 2014 invasion was after the games were held in Russia. So Putin stayed at the games, then went to Moscow, got permission to use military force from the Duma, and then the troops immediately went in, the so-called Little Green Men. And this time, it's something quite similar. I mean, there were all these threats to the West. First of all, the ridiculous demands made of NATO, that Ukraine can never join NATO. Well, who is Russia to decide who's going to join NATO? It's not even a member of NATO. And then to go back to 1997, so that all the countries like Poland, Baltic states, Romania would no longer be members of NATO. That was never going to be accepted. And I think it was obvious to the Russians that would not be accepted. So in other words, the war was going to take place no matter what the West did. And also, I think the demands made on Ukraine, what they're going to do with Ukraine, they're going to denazify, demilitarize, etc. Totally meaningless phrases. So how would you go about this, right? I mean, what is it they want? So, yeah, I was surprised. And also a little surprised, although perhaps I shouldn't have been, at how badly the Russian ground troops performed. I mean, to be honest, they've given a very stark display of Russia's military prowess. Many of them simply giving up, some of them just simply stealing and robbing as soon as they arrived. And the columns that were going towards Kiev, the columns of tanks, obviously ran out of gas. I mean, this logistical problems that you really shouldn't see in a modern army, and Russia seemed to have them all. So you have to think that there's some serious problems in Russia's military command, and there's a lot of corruption there as well. And now we're beginning to see it. But yeah, the initial decision did surprise me. Well, I mean, the one agency, if you like, that did predict that there was going to be a war was the United States. Yeah, yeah. They picked it up, but I think when you get statements from world leaders, you tend to think they're a little bit nebulous, or they may not be fully aware of all the facts. But obviously, Joe Biden was aware of all the facts because the intelligence agencies had kept him abreast of the situation. And he made a point of broadcasting every time Russia was about to do something. And as it turned out, extremely accurately. And I think this probably has now created a new faith in what US intelligence is saying from day to day. But on the other hand, no one knows the mind of Vladimir Putin, right? I mean, it's been impossible, and you couldn't really decipher what the Russians were going to do from the Security Council or Putin's personal spokesperson, Peskov. No one knew. Only Putin knew that he was going to invade on February 24th. And that's why I don't think people should really feel bad about it. And I think Zelensky, who had so many threats from Russia before, didn't take it all that seriously. And Zelensky, remember, his experience of US presidency has been Trump, the scandals, the impeachments, phone calls, and Zelensky himself kind of begging for help from the United States. So why would he suddenly trust what Biden is telling him? And, I don't blame Zelensky. I don't really blame the World Congress or whoever for failing to predict what was going to happen. The Atlantic Council, not to name many names, but the Atlantic Council, their journalists, analysts, have been predicting every single year since 2014 that a Russian major invasion is coming to Ukraine. Always, I think, anticipating it would come from the Donbass. And I think this year, 2022, was the first year there was no such prediction coming from that source. Because every year up to that point, they'd been wrong. And it was beginning to look a little farcical. Every year you get something on Atlantic Council saying, no, the Russians are going to invade this year. And nothing happens, over and over and over again. And, Russia's involved in Syria, it's heavily involved in Syrian war for quite a long time. And only after the Americans pulled out of Syria, Donald Trump ordered the troops out of Syria, and Americans pull out of Afghanistan almost immediately after Biden takes office, it's beginning to look like the United States is withdrawing from world affairs. The war in Syria, as far as Russia's concerned, is basically won. So then they go back to seeing, what is next on the agenda. Or we've got this war of attrition in the Donbass, which has been going on for 8 years now. Minsk agreement has never been fulfilled. No one is really interested in it anymore. So let's sort that one out, and sort it out not just by invading Donbass, but by bringing about a regime change in Kiev as well, and along the way causing as much destruction as possible. And I think that is what is really happening right now. And as far as Putin's concerned, I don't think he will lose any sleep over the fact that he may have lost, 10,000 troops or something like that. I think these numbers are bandied around. We don't know exactly how many, but a lot of troops. He won't care. He's got more. And the missiles are systematically destroying Ukraine, and people are being evacuated, or they're internal refugees. Over 10 million people now and rising. You could see Ukraine lose half its population by the time this war ends. And I think this is really the focus now, is what is going to be left when this is over. And these people who are coming to Poland, sometimes as far as to Canada, will they ever go back? Will they want to go back afterwards? This is really the questions I would ask. Well, I think much depends on one thing, and that is that the end of the war and the fall of Vladimir Putin coincide. Because I don't think there's any way the Ukrainian state can live with a Putin-ruled Russia next door. And it's extremely important that Putin is defeated in this war, one way or another, either brought down from the inside or leaves office for some other reason because of the failure of the war. At the moment, this is not happening, because I looked at a poll yesterday from Levada in Moscow. Putin's popularity is 81%. In other words, it's gone up since the war started. which suggests to me that Russians are getting a completely different message about this war from the one that we're getting in the West, which we know anyway from the Russian media. And they're being told that it's a special military operation. You're not allowed to call it a war. If you do call it a war, you get a 15-year prison sentence. So it's a special military operation. And the only Russians who are getting an objective view of this war are those who go through sort of independent social media or internet outlets out of the mainstream. In other words, people with a little computer savvy who know how to pick up foreign broadcasts and also independent media broadcasts, such as Telegram and others. And that's a small portion of the population. I would say about 5 to 10% at most of people in Russia are getting that view. The rest of them are watching TV and getting a barrage of propaganda about Ukrainians firing missiles on their own cities, committing war atrocities, being run by Nazis, or in the pay of NATO and the United States. This is the message that's coming across to Russians. And Putin has sent his army in there to protect Russians in Ukraine, Russian speakers, ethnic Russians in Ukraine. That's the message. So it's very difficult, I think, to explain this war. We may have to go back to the days of the Cold War and Radio Liberty sending illegal broadcasts into Moscow, which to some extent they're trying to do. But this is the extent, and it's also an age where social media is much more prevalent. You can fight these kind of hybrid wars with information, propaganda, simply telling lies about what is happening, and the people cannot get an accurate picture. So the only way these people will begin to understand the war is when all the body bags show up at the airport and their families are involved, right? They lost people. And the more that are killed, the better it would be for the rest of the world. And ultimately, Russians will find that economically, they're struggling as well, because various stores have closed, foreign companies have pulled out, the ruble's collapsed. Even the oligarchs no longer can take part in Western boards. They can't have assets abroad. Their assets abroad are frozen. Putin made a threat to deliver gas to Europe in rubles rather than dollars, which has, I think, been forgotten about now, but he did make that threat originally. In other words, there's going to be economic catastrophe for Russia, but also it will have repercussions for the rest of the world as well. So everybody's going to suffer, but the Russians will suffer the most. So that's the best route I could suggest for Ukraine to get out of this war intact with a state, with the exception that despite the odd missile coming towards Lviv or Ivano-Frankivsk, Western Ukraine, what we know as Western Ukraine, is not really on the Russian horizon. They have no interest in occupying Western Ukraine, because that part of Ukraine is considered quite different from what they perceive as Russia's Ukraine, the part of Ukraine that was part of the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire is much more significant today than it's been any time since it ended back in 1917, because this is somewhere in the mindset of Putin, is that he has a right to these territories because Russia occupied them during the Empire period, like Crimea, like southern Ukraine, even Poland, even parts of eastern Poland, I suppose. But really, the Russian Empire of the 19th century, I think, is the most accurate idea of where Putin is coming from. Putin, of course, is a very bad historian. He's shown this before when he's been talking about World War II. And if you look at the Russian Empire, you'll see a lot of flaws in his descriptions of where it should be. And I just said he's not interested in Western Ukraine, but of course, that part of Ukraine was Volhynia, Volyn, Rivne were part of the Russian Empire, but not the southern areas of Galicia. So I think that's really where Putin is coming from. But I think it's different now because Ukraine is independent. And in the earlier periods, I mean, you may have a Cossack kingdom, hetmanate, etc., is is quite different from an independent state that's recognized worldwide from 1991 as an independent state with particular borders that, are guaranteed by Budapest Memorandum back in 1994 when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. I think that's a little different from a Ukrainian land that over the years, over the centuries, has been populated by dozens of different groups at different times, which is not sort of something static. It changes from one time to another. In 1917 to 21, I think Ukraine had 8 different governments taking over. I mean, it was total chaos. People involved included Poles, Russians, British, French, Ukrainians, Jews, you name it. And also, of course, the German army, which occupied the land at the end of the First World War. It's really difficult to decipher what we mean by Ukraine in those periods. I would acknowledge that there is an entity of Ukraine. There are aspirations for independent Ukraine that clearly go back to the 19th century and were developed later. I would also acknowledge that Russians have a certain imperial mindset, and I think it's partly to do with the fact that they had a contiguous empire as opposed to European powers, or exclusively European powers like Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, wherever, where the empire was something far-flung. It was something a long way from the homeland. So Russia controlled this empire from Moscow, or actually from St. Petersburg until 1917. And this empire included the lands of Ukraine. And there's a difference between the Slavic lands of this empire and the non-Slavic lands. In other words, for Russians, Ukraine and Belarus mean a lot more than, say, Georgia or Moldova or Baltic states. And you could argue, I think, that Russians, for the most part, regard Ukraine as something that is part of them, part of their past, from the Kievan state onwards. But having just said all that, it's still, there are some anomalies. I mean, why, if Putin is in a war of liberation, right? He's coming to help the Donbass free itself and become independent. Why on earth do you destroy it? Right? I mean, why is Mariupol being destroyed when you would think that this is part of Ukraine that is most pro-Russian? These are where the ethnic Russians live. These where Russian speakers are. And this is the part of Ukraine that is being obliterated by Russian missiles. So that part, to me, on paper, if you want to sort of look back at history and say how Russians perceive Ukraine, that part doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, you would think they're coming to liberate. And it supported Yanukovych. And you would think Donetsk, Luhansk, Mariupol, these are even Berdyansk, which is outside the Donbass but still on the coast there. You would think that these are the parts of Ukraine that would be treated mildly, and that the missiles would maybe be fired at Kiev and they would probably hit Western Ukraine or somewhere like that. So that part doesn't make a lot of sense. It's only what Putin must be thinking as he's doing that, which is, if you can't win a military victory, just destroy everything. And this is what he's doing. Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. I would understand if people look back and say, well, they've always been doing that. But I think it's just a little more complex. I mean, in the past, of course, the danger, the real danger, was not properly understood, I would say. In terms of conferences, I mean, of course, we've not had in-person conferences for the last 2 years, right, which is kind of critical. But I was thinking about in October in Chicago when the American Slavic Congress meets again in person, how that Congress will deal with the Russians, right? With the Russian academics. Will they still be invited? And if they come, what kind of conversations will be taking place? Will the Russian academics talk to the Ukrainian academics and vice versa? My department, History, Classics and Religion, together with Modern Languages, had a competition for a visiting fellow, a Tompkins Fellow, who comes once every 2 years. And initially we'd selected a scholar from Moscow who, wants to study the Civil War period, and there's a lot of materials that we have over here that she would like to look at. And we've suspended that invitation. It's unfortunate, but there was a realization that A, it would not be very moral to invite a Russian scholar at this stage. And second, if she did come, what kind of reception would she be likely to get? Aside from the fact that she would have great difficulty getting a visa to Canada now, I would imagine, in the first place, since we don't have any kind of embassy in Moscow operating right now, or Kiev for that matter. So that's the kind of question we faced immediately. But in terms of how we think of modern Europe and how to deal with Russia, we're not really much further ahead, aside from the fact that, as you say, Russia is a paper tiger in some ways, but it's a paper tiger with nuclear weapons. And it's already threatened more than once to use those weapons. So a certain caution has to be applied. In other words, if you threaten to destroy Russia, or you get Ukraine into NATO, or NATO intervenes in some way on the ground, you would likely be starting World War III. And the same applies to a no-fly zone. If you have a no-fly zone, shoot down a Russian plane and see what happens there. It would perhaps trigger some kind of nuclear response. But then the broader question is, Russia's there, right? It's the largest country in the world. You can't sort of pretend it's not there. Not going anywhere. It's always going to be a neighbor of Ukraine, and Belarus for that matter. How do you deal with Russia in the future? And what are the limits? What can you say that you're not going to do? Well, as far as I'm concerned, Vladimir Putin is no longer a legitimate leader of Russia. And even you could say in the last two elections, he was there by default. He cheated in the elections. It's absolutely obvious. But at the moment, he controls everything. And I think this is not unknown to Russians. I mean, even the Russians who like Putin would acknowledge that he controls pretty well everything. The parliament Duma is a talking shop. The military is on his side. The FSB is on his side. There's no real restraint to Vladimir Putin. But you cannot deal with Russia as long as this guy is in charge. It would be like dealing with, I don't know, let's say a dictatorship under someone known for war crimes. I mean, there have been a number of leaders prosecuted for war crimes. Milosevic is the last one I can think of in Yugoslavia, but there have been others. He should be a pariah on that kind of a scale. And that, I think, is going to be the case for the next few years, unless there's a lack of unity on the European side, on the Western side. And then you have to ask which other states are likely to keep Putin around, which other states are likely to back Putin. And there I can think of a couple who might matter, namely China and India. The two most populous countries in the world right now are, if not supporting Putin, at least adopting a kind of benign attitude to Putin's Russia. So this is where I think we should be focusing. It's got to be maneuvers on an international scale to isolate Russia as long as Putin is in charge of Russia. And I think that should include China and India as far as possible, and that they have to be brought into negotiations. I mean, maybe it is. It's quite obvious that Ukraine has already had 6 different presidents and that parliament changes every time there's a national election. There's no question about that. Ukraine has faced a certain instability internally for some time. And, remember we've had conversations in the past where Zelensky has come under tremendous criticism from Ukrainians outside Ukraine and sometimes within as well. Ukraine has suffered from corruption, the role of the oligarchs like Kolomoisky who went back there. We've had bizarre episodes with, remember when Saakashvili, during the Poroshenko presidency, Saakashvili just crashed the border and came through. We've had the case of a major journalist who faked his suicide and then reappeared in Kiev. We've had cases of prominent journalists like Pavel Sharamet blown up by a car bomb in the middle of Kiev. It's not to say that Ukraine's not had serious problems, but on the whole, they've managed to keep this democratic status, and they've also managed to communicate it so that people from Belarus, for example, fleeing from Lukashenko, have gone to Ukraine because in Ukraine they feel completely free. You've also seen, I think, since the war has started, a unifying of forces around President Zelensky, which was totally unexpected. When he said, I don't need a taxi, just send me weapons. It was a defining moment. And now he's risen in status to a real figure, a real statesperson, you could say, who personifies the desire of Ukraine to be independent. I mean, this is why I think there's a good basis for a Ukrainian state, despite all this destruction, that can unite behind its president when the time is needed. It doesn't matter whether you're Russian speaking or Ukrainian speaking. It doesn't matter whether you're from Dnipro or whether you're from Lviv. You can have a common cause against this invasion, this occupation or attempted occupation from outside. Russia is in many ways quite a degenerate society. It's a society that really has no basis. You look at the way the Russian troops behave when they come to Ukraine. It's pathetic. I remember a few years ago in Washington, there's a discussion at the State Department, and someone asked Stephen Kotkin about the state of the Russian army. I believe it was just before Trump came to power, so it would be like 2016. And he said, in jest, of course, he said, the Russian army, you've got 10,000 super elite force, and you've got 100,000 dog food eating conscripts. And this turned out to be true. I mean, 6 years later, this is exactly what you've got. You've just got a mob entering Ukraine, sometimes asking for food, sometimes, just asking for help, sometimes just defecting. This is the Russian army today. So it's a sad reflection on Russian society. And as you've said, when there's some threat to Putin, the leader, whoever it is assassinated, or there's an attempted poisoning, or they're put in prison. It's the same in Belarus, actually. You could say that exactly the same thing has happened there. And Putin has adopted these methods since his third term as president. This is when I really started to notice it. Although even before then, he was removing journalists pretty quickly if they were writing nasty things about him. But now it's systematic. Even peace talks, right? There was an attempt to poison the people at the peace talks, like Abramovich. Even there, they attempt to do this. So this is life under the KGB, quite frankly, right? I mean, this is a fanatical former KGB agent. I was in a discussion in France this week, and one of the people from University of Nantes said that the KGB training school at Leningrad, where Putin was trained, was the most vicious and rigorous training school in Russia. This is really the hardcore KGB where Putin was trained to use these kind of methods. It's unacceptable in any modern society that you would have a president of a country using methods like these. And this is why, over again, I'm saying that Putin cannot be the leader of Russia. Joe Biden was right. He maybe shouldn't have said it out loud because it kind of cut him off from future discussions, but it's absolutely correct what he said about Vladimir Putin. Yeah, it's true. I mean, you can see a pattern, obviously, if you look back and put all these events together. I've actually done that in my class, right? That you've got to look at 2008 Russian invasion of Georgia, 2014 Russian invasion of Crimea, war in Donbass, and now this. But you could also say that this is a leader who's approaching 70 years of age, reflecting back on what he's achieved and what he's not achieved. And Ukraine is like a red light flashing somewhere in his head of something that's gone badly wrong. And therefore he makes a decision which is not carefully thought out, and it's much, much rasher in nature than anything he's done before. Because all the previous things that Putin has done, there was always a way out of it. He could always pull out. Crimea, okay, annex Crimea raises its popularity. The population is mainly ethnic Russian. There's a kind of historical past to that people identify with. The city of Sevastopol has always been flying Russian flags right through the Ukrainian independence period. That perhaps you could understand. Starting a war in the Donbass, if you look what Putin did there, he constantly withdrew. And the leaders that were too militaristic, too radical, and tried to go their own way, like Zaharchenko in Donetsk, were quickly removed. They were assassinated, almost certainly by Russian missile in his office while he was working. The leader of Luhansk was replaced. The leader of Donetsk now was selected to meeting in Rostov, Denis Pushilin. He's a native of Donbass, but nevertheless, he's completely compliant with anything that the Russians want to do. Go back even further. Igor Girkin Strelkov, the man who ordered the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner in 2014, he was too radical and too independent for Putin. So he was abandoned, simply abandoned, and left for himself. He goes to Donetsk and continues. So Putin has been extremely ruthless, but also extremely careful in what he's done until now. So to me, there is a pattern, but this is different. Somehow, one of the British analysts I heard on the radio said he went bonkers. Putin has gone bonkers. And it's something akin to that. This is an irrational decision made on the basis of emotion and made on a completely false premise that Ukrainians are going to welcome these troops in many regions, that the Ukrainian army is as decrepit as it was in 2014, not the case, and that there's no will in Ukraine to fight off an invasion. Again, about as far away from the truth as you could possibly be. So these are all fundamental mistakes made by Putin, and this time he's got no exit route. There's no exit route from this war, because if he loses it, he's gone. There's no way he could lose this war. How do you bring him to negotiate? You can't. There's no way to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. He's shown this time and time again. And this time, since he's gone this far, he should not even be at the table. So Russia has to be the obvious solution, but the path around Russia has to be blocked off. It should not be that Russia, if Germany, Slovakia, and all the others in Europe say, forget your gas line, we don't want it anymore, then China has to be persuaded to do the same, or India, or any of these countries that might take Russian gas, because you cannot give someone like this any outlets, unfortunately. I was kind of thinking along the lines of world organizations, right? And we've seen for the past 5 weeks or so the utter hopelessness of the United Nations and its Security Council as a means of resolving international conflict. Absolutely useless, because the system set up in 1945 where the war victors sit around a table and decide what's correct and what's not correct, no longer works. Every major decision involving countries like China or Russia can just be vetoed. Can you change that? I don't know. But one possibility might be to rotate that Security Council, membership of that Security Council. And there could be some kind of logic to that. You know, you say nation is something over 30 million people. I mean, for example, you can't have Kuwait as chairman of the National Security Council either. It's got to be some states of substance. But I think if the UN is ever going to work, you would have to do it along those lines. What other organizations are there? The OSCE. The OSCE in general has worked assiduously on trying to monitor the Minsk Accords, but ultimately failed to do so because they were violated over and over again by the separatist side. It's not strong enough, in other words, to do that. The G7 is only really an economic forum, you know, so-called richest nations. Council of Europe is basically due to Europe, European Union, the same thing. So there is perhaps room for a broader organization or reform of the United Nations. But ultimately, if you change the government in Russia, then you have to open doors to the new leadership that have not been opened before. You cannot simply exclude it. So in other words, if there's a NATO expansion that includes most of Eastern Europe, then includes, let's say, Ukraine becomes a member as well, against whom is this directed? As far as I can see, Russia is the only target of NATO right now. I mean, perhaps in the past it had to think about Iran, but right now it's only Russia. So you can see any Russian leadership is going to look at this and think, well, there's a military alliance, armed to the teeth, far larger than we've got. If you put all these weapons together, the United States alone is far larger than they've got. This might look frightening. So I think this is where you would probably have to start, is bringing Russia into discussions like, in fact, happened back in 1990, although it never really got anywhere, when NATO was debating its existence and brought in Russia as an observer of what was happening. The same to some extent of the European Union. Is Russia a European power or a Eurasian power? Do we treat Russia as one of our own? There were long negotiations between Russia and the European Union. The problem was that Russia wanted to be treated separately from everyone else in the European Union and be a kind of parallel organization. But that one needs to be rethought as well. This is the sort of lines I would be thinking of in the longer term, depending on how, you know, a post-Putin regime develops. Well, I think that's a bit harsh, because in theory, Ukraine was guaranteed its security by United States, United Kingdom, and Russia back in 1994, when it gave up its nuclear weapons. I mean, it was the world's third largest nuclear weapons power for 3 years, or 2.5 years. But it gave them up with a security guarantee. And this was followed, from what I recall, the Treaty of Friendship with Ukraine in 1997, followed by the Kharkiv Accords in 2010, which was basically about the Black Sea Fleet and extending the lease in Sevastopol for the Black Sea Fleet. But once again, Russia guaranteeing that it accepted the borders of Ukraine. So, you know, who apart from those three powers does Ukraine really need to secure its borders, right? You would think that would be enough. If it's got the Americans, the British, and the Russians securing the borders, no one's going to threaten Ukraine. So I don't really blame Ukraine. I think it did improve its army, as we're seeing today. I mean, it's withstanding an invasion by the world's largest country and the world's second largest military force. This is a staggering achievement by itself. So maybe it doesn't need a bigger army. You know, maybe you already suggested, like, maybe you can cut down the size of your military, and because perhaps it's not needed. Ukraine, I think, needs to focus on economic revival and also clearly needs and security interests have to be looked after. But where does Ukraine look for this, right? I mean, it's going to be next to Russia always. Geographically, it's a nightmare perhaps, but still, you cannot change that. And this is an unfortunate part of geography. But I think the change has to come in Russia, even though you perhaps implied that Russia has a permanent imperialist mindset, no matter who is in charge, right? You suggested that. For some time, the relations with Russia under Boris Yeltsin were chaotic, but they were not hostile. And in that period, you're looking at have I got this right? Oh, two different Ukrainian presidents, just Kravchuk and Kuchma, right? Until 2004. In 2004, when Yushchenko won the election, things started to get a little haywire, but by then you'd already got Putin as president of Russia. And I don't really count the Medvedev period, but that was a pretty hostile one as well. And then after 2012, when Putin comes back, he clearly is on a kind of messianic mission to make Russia a kind of global power, but carving it out of this former Russian empire, which he's doing now. And had this been successful, had the war in Ukraine been successful, I have absolutely no doubt that Russia would have occupied Georgia and Moldova, and perhaps even Armenia as well. They would not have stopped at that border. It's also very difficult, I think, to fight an urban war, as happened with the Americans in Iraq. It happens with the Soviets in Afghanistan, where again, the Mujahideen on paper did not match up to the Soviet army, but were able to hold out for 8 years and finally defeat them. And Ukraine has shown in 5 weeks that it can hold off the Russians indefinitely. What is the serious problem for Ukraine is the humanitarian catastrophe that has come with it, which is absolutely unnecessary, by the way. I mean, there's been no justification for any of the shelling of civilian buildings or hospitals or kindergartens by the Russians. It's completely unjustified, and it constitutes war crimes. These are war crimes taking place on a mass scale. They're nothing to do with the ground war. The ground war is failing. But the reason why we're so concerned today is the other side of it, the humanitarian disaster, the fact that Ukrainians are having to leave the country en masse. And there's a refugee crisis on the same scale as the Syrian refugee crisis. And this didn't need to happen. This is just Putin's choice of making that happen. I mean, I was thinking the other day that you've got a similar sort of crisis taking place in Yemen, but no one's talking about taking in Yemen refugees. It's a matter of where priorities seem to lie. And for a long time, this Donbass region was considered to be the heartland of the Ukrainian mafia under Yanukovych and his cronies. Donetsk, typical city. But of course, this is a city that comprises most of the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine between 2010 and 2014 in February. This is the group that's actually ruling Ukraine. But the fact is, Ukraine has always been multinational. No matter where you look in history, it's always been multinational. And you should look at the civic entity that Ukraine is when you talk about who is Ukrainian and who isn't Ukrainian. Right now, it seems that we realize that everybody in Ukraine who's fighting the Russians is Ukrainian. It doesn't matter, their ethnic background or language that they speak at home. They're Ukrainians, and that's should have been the case earlier. Obviously, it should have been the case earlier, and you get this refugee tragedy back in 2014. But I would say also that in 2014, the war went off the horizon after the 2015 Minsk Accords. It was put on the back burner because there were other serious issues that came to the fore at that time. And the fact that it went on for 8 years, with the casualties, I don't know, maybe 7 a week or something were dying in this war. It was happening, but not on a massive scale. It was contained. And this has been a typical policy of Russia, is to leave these unfinished conflicts wherever it goes. So Transnistria, for example, it still exists today. I mean, this ridiculous republic, which still has a Soviet flag flying, and statues of Lenin and whatever. And then you've got Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the breakaway regions of Georgia. That issue is far from settled today. It's not, resolved in any way. And then you've got the Donbass, where what is the Donbass going to be in the future? Is it going to be independent? Is it going to be part of Russia? Is it going to be part of Ukraine? I don't think there's any clear solution to that, and how you reach there. Right now, these cities are devastated. The industries need complete revamping. And this was the industrial heartland of Ukraine for quite a long time, with the coal and the steel and the chemicals. This is with the sort of heartland of Ukraine's industry. So what do you do in the future? What is Ukraine going to rely on in terms of industrial development? And it's a serious problem, right? I mean, who's going to put the money into this area? This is why Russia doesn't want it, is not prepared to invest there. They've declared independence. Russia has now recognized them as independent states, but they're not really states at all. They're states that only exist because Russia has kept them in place for the past 8 years. If you had a free election in these states, the leaders would all be changed overnight. I'm convinced of it. There's no one, very few people there who would back up these militaristic gangsters who are holding power. So I think Ukraine should hang on to as much as it can. I mean, maybe Crimea is lost for now, although it should never be off the agenda. But I don't think Donbass should be lost. I mean, the whole idea of retreating is that there's no possible stopping point. Where do you stop? Kherson, what do you do with Kherson? What do you do with Odessa if you give up Donbass? So you have to be really, really careful on how much is given up. And I would say Zelensky probably realizes this, right? That you're fighting for all your country. I would just add that if, in its present state, to look in the long term, because you're not looking at a war that's going to end anytime soon. The negotiations, whether they're in Israel or Turkey or whatever, won't bring anything. And that you have to be prepared for sort of 8 to 10 years of this stuff happening. And Ukraine should be aided, I would say, with the most modern weapons that we've got available. Because Ukraine is genuinely fighting this war for all the countries in the neighborhood, all of whom would be vulnerable to this kind of attack, whether they're in NATO or not. So Ukraine needs to be helped. And short of a full-scale NATO intervention, there's a lot more that could be done.